Thanks, Gary. It's great to be here. And I really like the title of this session, Addicted to Growth, or at least Addicted to Growth at All Costs, because I think that is the problem. We are addicted to this system, and I think it's going to take some significant therapy to get out of this. And I have a 12-step program. I'll get to that at the end. But first of all, can we turn the front lights off down a little bit? First of all, who's heard the term Anthropocene before? Yeah, so this is a pretty well-informed audience. We live in a whole different world. I mean, it's a whole new geologic era where humans and their artifacts and our use of energy has really begun to affect the functioning of the entire planetary system. So, it's a full world, as Herman Daly and others have called it, full of humans and their artifacts. So, what does that mean? It means we have to start thinking differently. Business as usual is no longer an option. As some have said, business as usual is the utopian fantasy. It's going to require a transition to a different system. And I guess the question really is that transition going to involve a collapse and having to rebuild from that collapse, or is it going to involve a smoother transition into something much better, better than the growth economy? To solve these kinds of complex problems requires, I think, that we integrate these three elements of having an adequate vision, not only of how the world is, our scientific understanding, and that's changing rapidly as we learn more about how complex adaptive systems function, as we learn more about human psychology, particularly positive psychology, what actually does contribute to human well-being, as we learn more about planetary boundaries and tipping points, etc. But we also need a better, more adequate vision of how we would like the world to be. What sort of future do we really want? What does a sustainable and desirable future really look like, and how can that be better than the future that we seem to be headed toward with the growth at all costs model? Our tools and analytical techniques, our implementation strategies, policies, etc., need to be integrated with and consistent with that changing and adaptive vision. And we talk about addiction. I think we have a lot to learn from overcoming individual addictions. And one of the first things you learn there is that the worst thing you can say to an addict is, you're doing the wrong thing, you've just got to stop doing this, you're killing yourself, etc. I mean, that immediately evokes a defensive, denial kind of reaction. And in fact, that's the kind of reaction that we're getting from society with the kinds of message that we're presenting. Not that it's not absolutely true. But if you want to, if you want some therapy that works, I think we've got to take a different strategy. So we know, for example, that the world is a complex, nonlinear adaptive system. There are thresholds, there are tipping points, there are surprises. This is some of the potential tipping points in the climate system, including the ice sheets melting, but also a whole range of other things. Dieback of the Amazon rainforest, the tundra melting and releasing methane, et cetera, et cetera. So things could change quite radically, quite quickly, quite unexpectedly. Because of that, I was part of a large group that tried to put together, what is the safe operating space on this finite planet? And we tried to identify the planetary boundaries. We came up with these 9 boundaries, including 3 that we thought were clearly outside the safe operating space already and needed to be brought back in. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle, and several others rapidly approaching that safe operating space or boundary. So recognizing or re-recognizing that there are limits to this finite planet that we're inhabiting. And we're quickly approaching the cliff in many cases, and we should back off. If our vision of the future is to have a sustainable and desirable place for humanity within this system. Now, this is not the movie that most people are lining up to go see, unfortunately. And as I said, part of the reason for that is that the way it's being framed is we're doing the wrong thing. We've got to stop doing it. So I think we have to start thinking of this in a different way, and we need actually a third movie. We need a movie that's a much more positive vision of a sustainable and desirable economy in society, in nature. And I put it in those terms just to emphasize the fact that that's the framing that's required. You can no longer think about the economy as being separate from the rest of nature, or humans being separate from the rest of nature. And recognize that we can't manage the economy if we don't understand its interaction with, its interdependence with, its embeddedness in society, its that embeddedness in the rest of nature. So that's the vision thing that's got to change, and it also has to be consistent with the changing science. We have a report that we did recently for the Rio Plus 20 meeting. That goes into a lot more detail about what this society might look like. It sort of paints a picture of how life would be in that society, and also goes into some of the details on what sorts of policies we might implement to do it. And you can see from the list of authors here, several of the co-authors are going to be presenting later in this session, including Josh Farley and Peter Victor. So. And this is a synthesis of some of the ideas around ecological economics and how we can actually create this new society. The key points in this argument are that this growth in material consumption and throughput is not sustainable. There are fundamental planetary boundaries. That it's also not desirable. It has negative side effects and on social and natural capital, and in the overdeveloped economies, and so it's not really increasing well-being, as I'll show later. And there's some good evidence and data to back that up. And there are viable alternatives. We can create a better world that doesn't consume as much, but also doesn't depend on economic growth as being and consumption and production of marketed goods and services as being the major source to human well-being. There's lots of other things that contribute. One way of looking at it is that this is the old model of the world, the empty world vision. And as Brian has already said, there's land, labor, and capital. Land is kind of grayed out. There's the assumption of perfect substitutability. You don't really need land or natural resources to produce goods and services. Again, these are private marketed goods and services measured by GDP. That's all GDP measures, is what's going on in the market, not what's going on everywhere else in the world, which is the most important. As Robert Kennedy said, GDP measures everything except what's really important to us. The idea is the more we consume, the better off we are, and we can reinvest some of that GDP back in creating more capital so we can produce more in the future and have the whole thing continue to grow. So there's nothing in this vision, and I think this is the vision that drives a lot of our policy these days, that would limit the continual growth of this system. It also implies that private property rights are the best way to go because you're talking about private goods and services, and ignores everything having to do with land and also everything having to do with society. As Margaret Thatcher once said, there's no such thing as society. Well, there is such a thing as society, I will argue. We are here. I don't think there's any denying that. And this is maybe a better picture of the whole system. We have to recognize that there are at least these four fundamental types of assets that are all required to produce any sorts of human well-being, including economic production, but also directly contributing to human well-being. So we have conventional built capital, labor, but broadened to recognize the idea that it's human capital is information, it's human health, it's not just labor. Social capital is all the interactions among people, all of our formal and informal networks and institutions, and the market itself is a form of social capital. It's just an institution that we've constructed to help allocate these resources. And finally, natural capital, everything else in the system. We live in a materially closed system. Everything has to go somewhere. We produce pollution and waste as byproducts that have disamenity effects, et cetera. And also, we're learning a lot more about what actually does contribute to human well-being and finding that there are rapidly decreasing marginal returns to income and consumption. Tim Kasser is a psychologist. He'll be giving a talk actually in Canberra on the 7th of October. If you want to learn more about this, he wrote a book called The High Price of Materialism that shows that people with more materialistic kinds of orientations actually have higher rates of both mental and physical illness and are not self-reporting as well off as people who have lower emphasis on material production, consumption. There's a whole field of positive psychology, or the science of happiness, as it's called. It's beginning to understand what actually does contribute to well-being, and certainly consumption only does up to a point, or at least that it decreases quite rapidly as you have enough, and the point becomes more keeping up with the Joneses and relative consumption rather than absolute consumption, even on the consumption side. Much less everything else that contributes to well-being. And I think if you look at your own lives, you'll recognize that your friends, your family, your participation, in society, your support of your life from ecosystems and natural capital contribute a lot more. So, on that last point, natural capital and the ecosystem services that it provides are extremely important in supporting human well-being. So if you don't know, ecosystem services are defined as the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems, whether they recognize and perceive those benefits or not. Nature, we live on a spaceship, and that spaceship is providing for all of our needs, and has, for the entirety of the evolutionary history of humans. What we haven't done is we have done now is begin to quantify and understand those complex interconnections between provisioning services, regulating, cultural, supporting services. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, and all the various constituents of human well-being, which go much beyond pure subsistence. There is, however, one thing missing from this diagram, and that is the interaction with the other three types of capital that I mentioned. So, in fact, what we need to understand is how natural capital and the human economy and society that's embedded within it interact in order to produce sustainable well-being. Natural capital's contribution to that interaction is defined as ecosystem services. They don't just flow directly. But it means that to solve this problem of creating a sustainable and desirable future is inherently a transdisciplinary effort. You can't, ecologists can't do it alone, social scientists can't do it alone, economists can't do it alone. It's going to require all of those disciplines working together. And this is not exactly the way academia is set up these days, as you might have perceived. But I think it is the way that things need to change to have much more emphasis on understanding this complex system and how those interactions work. There is a lot of traction, I think, growing for this idea of ecosystem services. There's something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that's just been established. This is the IPCC equivalent for ecosystem services, so it's got that sort of intergovernmental high-level thing going on. There's also the Ecosystem Services Partnership that I was involved in establishing that is a good place to go if you want to learn more about who's doing what in this field of ecosystem services and how to create networks and, and interact with some of the scientists and practitioners that are working here. There's been a huge increase in the scientific interest in this topic, and this is just the number of papers published per year on the topic of ecosystem services going up exponentially. The most highly cited of those is this one that we did back in 1997, where we, as a meta-analysis, where we tried to estimate the total value of all of these ecosystem services, their contribution to human well-being. It's all mainly outside the market, not marketed goods and services, but other things like storm protection, like recreation, et cetera, things that don't get marketed. And the bottom line was that they're significantly larger than global GDP at the time. And this is definitely an underestimate for various reasons. So if you want to think about the economy as everything that contributes to human well-being, well, conventional economists are missing way more than half, probably way more than a quarter of what actually contributes to this real, economy of human well-being, by missing out on ecosystem services and natural capital, and also missing out on social capital. Oops, oh yeah. So there's one thing that we didn't control in this process. That was what they put on the cover, and they said pricing the planet. We didn't really mean pricing. We meant valuing the planet in a very different context, in a very different way. And this is not, ecosystem services are not intended to be marketed in a conventional market, or privatized, or commoditized, et cetera. But they are valued, and there's no way to avoid valuing them either. It's not like we can choose to do this or not do it, because every time we make a decision that affects ecosystem services, we are implicitly assigning a value to them. So better to do it, out in the open, better to understand those interconnections in order to help us get there. More recently, as part of the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity study, these values were updated, and so there's been a lot more studies that have happened since then, and we use that information to say, how have things changed since 1997? In 1997, we estimated about $33 trillion a year is the contribution. Between the two, we estimated that we've lost about somewhere between probably closer to $20 trillion a year. This is larger than the U.S. GDP. Just in terms of the losses, the reduction in ecosystem services due largely to land use change. So we are losing our natural capital and the value of that natural capital. That's a cost of this growth in built capital and other things. This is how it was calculated. I won't spend any time on that. But you're welcome to take a look at the paper and get a feel for how that was done. Also, we know that when we convert intact ecosystems to alternative uses, intensive wetlands to intact wetlands to intensive farming, for example, there's a net loss of value. This money goes to private owners, but we lose the social value of all of these ecosystem services by quite a lot. We did an estimate a few years ago to look at, well, what's the benefit-cost ratio of investing in maintaining and increasing our natural capital assets? And we used a scenario where we increased the global reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere, 30% of the marine biosphere. That would cost about $45 billion a year to build and maintain. But the benefits would be the net difference between the intact and the converted system would be about $4 to $5 trillion a year. So, and conservatively estimated benefit-cost ratio of 100 to 1. So I challenge you to find too many better investments, for society these days. The only one I could find was for oil companies investing in political campaigns in the United States, which is about 400 to 1, unfortunately, and probably similar for the coal industry in Australia. So anyway, there are lots of uses for this valuation exercise on natural capital, including just raising awareness, but also changing national income accounts. So we spend so much time worrying about GDP, but we know that ecosystem services, natural capital are not included. Well, there are efforts to do that. In fact, the Australian Bureau of Statistics is very actively trying to incorporate ecosystem services into national accounts. To analyze specific policies and land use and regional planning projects, what happens to the value of the whole landscape, not just the marketed part of the landscape when you make these changes in land use. This idea of payment for ecosystem services has been very effective, for example, in Costa Rica, in reforesting the whole country by paying landowners to supply these ecosystem services. Full cost accounting, I think, is a really critical one. The price of everything. The market is not telling us the truth about the price of things, the cost of things. Why is it? Well, there's all these environmental and social externalities that are not included in the price. If we could somehow get them into the price, then people would be making at least a better approximation to sustainable kinds of decisions, or at least recognizing the full cost of what they're doing. And there are efforts to do that. I'll point out one example. And finally, I think we need different institutions to manage these kinds of common assets. And this idea of common asset trusts is one that Peter Barnes and others have suggested. And we've recommended that we think of the atmosphere, for example, as a common asset. Governments should perform their role under the public trust doctrine of being trustees of that common asset and charge those who damage it for damages, and they could reward those who benefit it through payment systems or other kinds of economic incentives. But let's take that a lot more seriously. On the full cost accounting side, there's a company called True Cost that I've been involved with as an advisor that tries to do just that. They have a fairly elaborate system for estimating the ecosystem service and health costs associated with businesses, both their local operations but also their entire supply chain. So they can look at, these estimates are used by, for example, Newsweek's ranking of businesses, and they're used by the companies themselves, including Puma, who's doing an environmental profit and loss statement to begin to understand, where are their liabilities out there in terms of the environment. True Cost recently did a study of the external unpriced capital costs of just the primary processing and primary production sectors around the world, and found that that totaled about $7.3 trillion a year, again, just from those two sectors. So these external costs are huge and estimable, you know, imprecisely, but certainly estimable, at least to put those numbers on the table and say, well, what are we losing when we make decisions that benefit just the marketed economy at the expense of the rest of the real economy? On the social capital side, and I notice you have this book over there on the table. This is from Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett's book, The Spirit Level. We know that there are strong relationships between the amount of inequality, income inequality in a society, and the whole range of social problems, including trust and obesity and even life expectancy and infant mortality. The United States is way up here. You know, Japan and Scandinavia are way down here. The more unequal a society is, the harder it is to build social capital, the harder it is to actually contribute, or to have that contribute to well-being. We know that income inequality after the Second World War in particular was decreasing in almost all countries. This is the percentage that the top 1% get of income in these few countries. So in the post-war period, it was declining quite rapidly after 1980 and the Reagan and Thatcher changes. It's been going back in the other direction. Now the United States is as unequal in its income distribution as it was in 1920 before the Great Depression. This has a big impact on quality of life, on well-being, on genuine progress, as we'll show. This was an interesting study out of Harvard where they asked Americans across the whole political spectrum. They asked them, you know, what did they think the distribution of wealth was in the country? They thought it would look like this, where this is the top 20% here and the bottom 20% here. This is what it actually looks like, you know, significantly worse in terms of income distribution. The bottom 20% have very little. And then they asked them what would they like it to be, you know, and they came up with this, which looks a lot more like Sweden than it does like the United States. And it was surprising that this was, you know, it wasn't a right-left, you know, conservative, Democrat sort of distribution. It was, everybody thought that it should be more equal. Robert Putnam, back in 2000, actually did some mapping of social capital across the United States based on participation in bowling leagues and voting and other sorts of social clubs, and came up with this distribution across the states. Anybody know what state this is? Nevada. Yeah, it's got Las Vegas, and yeah, not much social capital going on there. Anyway. But it turns out that, you know, there are strong correlations between his social capital index and a whole range of things. Murder rates are lower the more social capital there is. TV watching by 4th and 8th graders is lower the more social capital. The education performance by state is much higher the more social capital. And the health index is higher the more social capital, similar to the results that Wilkinson and Pickett got. But using a social capital index rather than income inequality. The two are obviously related. We know also that if you plot GDP per capita against mean life satisfaction, if you ask people how satisfied they are with their lives, you get a plot that looks like this, where there is quite a strong relationship at first, but after a while it basically disappears. There's decreasing marginal returns. 1 minute? Really? Oh, I wasn't even looking at you. That's what. Okay, so anyway, of course we use GDP. Hayden, can I have a few minutes of your time? I got about 4 or 5 minutes left, I think. Yeah. Anyway, GDP is unfortunately what we use. GDP is the wrong measure. It was never designed to measure well-being. It's definitely time to leave GDP behind, and this is a short paper we did in Nature recently that gets into that. There's a whole range of alternative indicators. I won't go through these. They're based on adjustments to GDP, different kinds of surveys, various kinds of composite indices. Let me just talk briefly about one, though, because I think this is really interesting. The genuine progress indicator starts with personal consumption, weights it by income distribution, because we've found that that's important to social capital, adds a few things that are left out, household labor, volunteer work, and subtracts a whole bunch of things that shouldn't be counted as positive, including impacts on natural capital and social capital, costs of air and water pollution. For the United States, it looks like this, correlated with GDP up until about 1980, then flattening off even though GDP was going up. So the state of Maryland has adopted the genuine progress indicator as one of their primary indicators. So there are some uptake in the political realm. The state of Vermont has done the same. Several other U.S. states are beginning to do that. I would direct you to this website if you want to learn more about how this all works. So they come out with press releases that look more like this, you know, what's happening to their GPI, not their GNP. Recently, we looked at all of the GPI studies that have been done around the world, and we found 17 of them. This is Australia, interestingly, at the top of the heap. They all have a similar sort of pattern to the U.S. one, and we compared that with a bunch of other indicators, including life satisfaction and ecological footprint. For the U.S., GPI does this, GDP does this on an index scale. Take a look at China. China's GDP has gone through the roof, literally, and GPI tracked it for a while, but since 1995, GPI has leveled off as well. So all of these costs of economic growth are beginning to balance out and outweigh the benefits. At the global scale, we put an index together globally, GDP per capita, GPI per capita. So we're now in, you know, and have been since 1978 or so globally, in a period of uneconomic growth. So if anybody says we need more economic growth, you could say, yes, we do. When have we had some? You know, I want to start an economic growth deniers club, you know, so that whenever they have somebody on TV saying, you know, we need more economic growth, well, we could say, yeah, well we haven't had any, so how are we going to get some? You know, and how we're going to get some is we're going to have to start paying much more attention to natural capital and social capital. So we have to respect planetary boundaries, but we also have to produce the maximum amount of elements of human well-being and quality of life. We want to be in the donut, as it's been called. That's going to require, a sustainable scale of the economy within the ecological system, a fair distribution of resources. So we have to reduce inequality, and a more efficient allocation. The UN process of sustainable development goals was mentioned, and in fact, those goals fit nicely under these three basic goals for the new economy. They did say economic growth down here, and there has been, I think, a lot of discussion and a lot of people in that process trying to change that to prosperity or something less less directly about the conventional growth. And I think that dialogue is still going on and may end up getting there. So we're going to have to break our addiction to this growth at all costs paradigm. And again, I say it is really an addiction. And to do that, and to break out of addictions at the individual level, requires that you have a dialogue, you create a vision of a positive future, a world where it is sustainable and desirable, that focuses more on quality of life. There's a book over here on the shelf that we're just coming out with. It's a series of essays by people around the world to try to paint that picture. Say, here's what that world could look like. Here's why life there would be better. And we also have a journal called Solutions, which is also over there, that tries to have a dialogue. And I encourage you to take a look at that and contribute some of your own ideas to what the solutions will be. And I think I don't have time to get into the 12-step program, or do I? I can go through it really quick. No? He's saying no. Okay. We mentioned prosperity without growth. We mentioned Peter Victor is going to talk more about this, I think, and he showed that, in fact, you can have a stable, steady-state economy that has lower unemployment, better quality of life, et cetera. And he did this using a conventional kind of model of the Canadian economy. And he had, some things that had to change in order to get to that new economy. And so this is the 12-step program. New meanings and measures of success, we talked about that. Things like GPI rather than GDP. Limits on materials, energy, waste, land use, and population. So we have to stay within planetary boundaries. More meaningful prices, full cost accounting, just more durable, repairable products. Fewer status goods, so we don't want to consume things just for status. We want to have other ways of contributing to well-being. More informative advertising and bans on advertising to children. Better screening of technology. We want technology to be a good servant, but not a master. More efficient capital stock. more local, less global. This is not just to reduce transport costs, but because local economies actually construct and help increase social capital. And that leads directly to well-being. Reduce inequality, we talked a lot about that already. Less work, more leisure. Anybody opposed to this one? Okay. And education for life and not just work. The idea is that also building human capital, educating people contributes to well-being directly, not just to get a job, to buy more stuff, et cetera. And finally, of course, there's always a skeptic in the back of the room, you know, saying, yeah, what if it's all a big hoax and we create this better world for nothing? Well, we need to just focus on creating the better world. And that's my argument here, to break our addiction to growth, we need to say how the world can be, a non-growing world can be a much better place where we have much happier people going forward. And we have an organization where we're trying to get together. And in fact, I think if you'll find that there are a lot more people out there that are presenting the same message than you might imagine. So we need an alliance of all of those people for sustainability and prosperity, and I'll stop there. Thank you.